A voice declared they had finally found the perfect groom for their child, echoing through the darkness like a verdict that could not be escaped. Then a blonde-haired woman sat at the table, gripping her knife and fork tightly as she stared down at her untouched meal. Still, a priest-like man, a light-haired woman, a brown-haired man, and a dark-haired woman sat in silence around the formal dining table. Pope Borgia sat with calm authority, his steady gaze making it clear he was in complete control. Still, a girl with swirling patterns across her face gripped her stomach as a wave of nausea overtook her. Enzo Borgia slammed his fist on the table and shouted that it was far too soon for another broken engagement. A calm and composed man quietly spoke the name Enzo. A standing man questioned the others at the dinner table, insisting that her feelings should come before any alliance. Someone off-screen questioned Enzo about when he started caring so much for her, saying his sudden brotherly concern was baffling. Someone off-screen challenged Enzo, asking if he cared so much, why not fight the barbarians himself instead of the Britannia troops? A brash, confident knight insisted he could defeat the barbarians, but an older man cut in and harshly shut down his boasting. A blonde woman leaned forward, asking her father what kind of person he thought the man was. A well-dressed man with a charming smile gestured grandly, saying the golden boy of Britannia was truly exceptional. A confident, dark-haired man laughed at the dining table as he told the brown-haired boy the king's nephew was a famous and handsome northern knight. A defensive and emphatic unseen character shouted to father that they absolutely refused, insisting the man in question had an even worse reputation than father himself. An ominous blonde woman warned her father to be careful what he wished for. A menacing white-haired knight stood over 4 fallen bodies, and someone warned that this northern knight would one day slaughter the entire family. A dark-haired man gently touched Ruby's shoulder, quietly calling her name as she kept her gaze low and sadness lingered between them. A dark-haired man sat behind a startled blonde woman and stroked her face, while she complained that Cesar was making her uncomfortable and insisted she knew what to say. Cesar de Borgia stepped into view, his name announced as Pope Borgia's eldest son. A young man with light brown hair let out a displeased grunt, slumping in his chair and making his irritation clear. A calm, content woman smiled fondly as a gentle, serene man in religious vestments sat beside her, both radiating peaceful happiness. A tense and determined figure clenched their fists, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. A blonde young woman beamed with gratitude, telling her father she was overjoyed to help and wanted to be a useful daughter in any way. A joyful man laughed and agreed enthusiastically, sharing a bright moment with a smiling, pleased woman surrounded by delicate flowers. A dark-haired man gazed at the blonde woman, warmth in his eyes as she laughed with genuine joy. The dark-haired man leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to the blonde woman's forehead, his affection quiet but unmistakable. A dark-haired man smiled gently and told Ruby she was being a good girl. The blonde woman told herself she would figure out her next move only after letting herself be sick as much as she needed. A lone knight with white hair loomed over a motionless figure, while someone else braced for death at the hands of the North's greatest warrior. A twisted wreck burned on the ground, while a person reflecting on their death from a helicopter crash remembered thinking freedom had finally come. Still, thorny vines curled around the blonde woman as she admitted she hadn't expected what happened next. A silhouetted man appeared in the doorway, while a blonde woman realized she had become a character from a novel she once read. 2 women stood side by side in the shadows, both weighed down by the same miserable fate that haunted the narrator's previous life. A menacing presence with glowing eyes stood in the doorway, and the blonde woman thought she had entered another wretched hell. A tall arched window opened onto a silent balcony, sunlight streaming in as calm settled over the grand building and the trees below. A blonde-haired woman knelt over an ornate toilet, retching loudly as her sickness echoed in the dimly lit room. The blonde-haired woman let out a frustrated sigh, wondering aloud why she couldn't have been born into a better family if given a second chance. Someone skilled but suffering from secret vomiting admitted it still hurt, no matter how well they hid the pain. Still, a vulnerable young woman wrapped in translucent fabric quietly admitted that, just like before, she struggles with anorexia in this life too. A faded memory surfaced as a small girl sat on a man's lap, surrounded by a family she once called her own. A shadowed adult figure stood behind a young girl with brown hair and pigtails, as she recalled being just an ordinary girl from South Korea. Now the vulnerable young woman sat with her hands clasped, quietly admitting she was adopted by an elite Spanish family as their charity case. Still, the group of girls walked together in polished school shoes as the narrator reflected on enjoying privileges meant for children of wealthy families. Then she remembered telling herself she would fit in, so she started ballet, tennis, and horseback riding to become a perfect socialite. But she soon understood she would never truly belong, as the three boys laughed and singled out the girl with mocking gestures. Then a young woman with dark hair recalled the first time classmates mocked her, thinking she should just laugh along with their taunts. Still, a boy with medium-length hair forced a nervous smile, not realizing he was the one they were making fun of. Moments later, a lone student grew older and found the bullying from shadowy figures slowly became something she could survive. Still, an isolated and overshadowed child stood in a pool of light, surrounded by family who seemed perfect but hid something darker. Still, two unfaithful parents embraced their secret lovers, while a reckless family member stood close to his two complicit associates. Still, the person recalling family history explained that the only one who had shown kindness was her older sister, but she died at 21. Then, a mysterious and seemingly normal man stood silently before the woman with light brown hair, as she recalled believing he was the most stable. Then, a reflective figure sat facing an imposing presence and realized the monster in front of them was no different from their own father. Then, a brown-haired girl shrank back as a shadowy hand reached for her, and she tried to act bright and intelligent. Moments later, a girl with short hair forced a smile as a dark hand gently patted her head, feeling obedience settle deep within her. Still, a fearful eye widened as its owner recalled that every failure meant she was forced to pay a painful price. Still, the narrator admitted that even in this new place, things were hardly any better. When the narrator was about 16, she remembered stumbling upon an online fantasy novel called Sodom and the Holy Grail. A blonde girl stepped into the shadows and declared she was now Rebecca de Borgia, the villainess of the story. A corrupt pope in ceremonial robes raised his staff over the crowd, and the narrator explained that the story centered on his abuse of religious power. Northern nobility and righteous priests united in defiance, joining forces to eliminate Pope Borgia and his family. Two opposing swordsmen faced each other before a seated leader, as the crowd below raised their hands in silent support. Poetic justice had arrived. A blonde girl in a red dress fell into darkness, thinking she was Rebecca, the daughter of the Pope. An aggressor holding a blood-stained dagger loomed over a defenseless blonde girl sprawled on the ground, threatening her with silent menace. A wounded white-haired man stared upward, convinced he was fated to die by his husband's hand. Petals glowed faintly in the darkness, as the story of a young woman forced into countless arranged marriages quietly unfolded. A pale-haired regal figure in a fur-collared cape stood serenely before the stained glass, silent and imposing against the colored light. A regal figure touched a young and respectful youth with a sword, bestowing knighthood as armored guards stood solemnly behind. A young man with dark hair stepped into the arena, facing a chained demonic monster as the tournament crowd watched in tense anticipation. He stood alone in the spotlight, as the announcer declared that he had become the youngest champion in the event's history. After his victory, a young man with dark hair quickly became a celebrated paladin, drawing the admiration of many blushing young women. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the darkness, and two women stared ahead, shock and surprise clear on their faces. A young man with pale hair glared to the side, his red eyes burning with a cold, dangerous intensity. Still, a young man with dark hair coldly rejected every marriage proposal and vowed to remain abstinent, which deeply troubled his father. A woman smiled as she grabbed the man's arm, while someone quietly explained that his younger sister and Freya changed after their mother's death. A princess deeply in love stood alone beneath the darkening sky, thinking back to when she first lost her heart to Duke Omerta. Their story ended suddenly when the tragic and desperate woman took her own life, leaving only her bare feet beside abandoned shoes. A young girl cried, clutching a young boy's hand as the smoky air pressed in around them. Still, two siblings held each other's hands, the pain of their past leaving them forever changed. A world shrouded in darkness kept the souls of those who ended their own lives trapped, making the Duchess's death a subject few dared to discuss. A frustrated young woman with light hair muttered that she couldn't remember the novel's details, no matter how hard she tried. Two hands, one with a ring, intertwined softly as someone wondered why a stubborn man would agree to marry Rebecca. A confident young man in a decorated uniform laughed beside the serene bride, saying his sister would have married Enzo if not for him. A blonde woman sat quietly at the table, resting her chin on her hand as she remarked that true sacrifice showed real brotherly love. Barren streets stretched between crumbling buildings as the narrator explained that Romana's troops were deployed away from the border, leaving it open to invasion. Then, the narrator revealed that Britannia had been the one to request the marriage. Still, the narrator wondered aloud what could have driven Iski to murder his in-laws. A silhouetted woman with long white hair raised her teacup and began to explain her reasoning. A broken teacup spilled across a dark surface, as the narrator revealed that Rebecca had poisoned his sister. A contemplative girl with long hair sat alone by the window, quietly thinking that both the husband and wife had their own reasons for betrayal. Ominous figures watched as a confident woman with long blonde hair, surrounded by her servants, was rumored to be both a villainess and the Pope's spy. In the grand hallway, an authority figure forced Iski's sister and his childhood friend to bow and serve her like mere maids. Still, the narrator quietly noted that 3 years had passed since arriving in this unfamiliar story. A blonde woman in elegant attire sat by the window, quietly thinking that she could understand why the beloved princess of Romana turned out that way. A blonde woman watched from inside as laughter and white feathers drifted past the window, separated from the joyful group outside. A golden-haired girl smiled joyfully as white feathers drifted around her, their glow casting a gentle light across her face. A giant dark hand loomed over a tiny puppet, its strings pulling tight against a backdrop of painted flowers. A faint outline of a cage hovered in the darkness as the narrator quietly considered how Ruby had managed to grow into a decent person despite everything. Light spilled from the doorway as a mysterious and formal figure called out for Ruby. A woman with long wavy hair gasped in surprise as Cesar entered the room. The dark-haired young man flinched, admitting quietly that the sudden movement behind him had startled him. Cesar entered and told the blonde woman he had noticed her distress, while she replied that he always seemed to understand her. The outspoken blonde girl yelled that she found the act disgusting and demanded it stop. A concerned man in dark clothes asked the reserved woman if she was dissatisfied with their marriage arrangement. A massive reptilian eye stared ahead as a stern figure assured someone they could speak with complete honesty. A person in black refused to tell the truth, saying they hated turtles and accusing the blonde girl of wanting to hit them. The blonde woman admitted she wasn't unhappy, but quietly said the north felt very distant. A concerned young man admitted he'd feel lonely not seeing her often, while the reassuring woman reminded him he'd have his husband beside him. A distressed woman asked what use a husband was, confessing she only wanted to spend her life with the comforting man beside her. A respectful and gentle man placed his hand on the seated woman's head and quietly said he felt honored. The dark-haired young man smiled and quietly marveled that the most beautiful woman in Romana wanted to stay by his side. A hand hovered on someone's head, danger simmering beneath the gentle touch. The guarded woman sat quietly, reflecting that even a gentle presence could threaten to bring down her defenses. A blue butterfly hovered in the darkness. Everything could change in a single heartbeat. A somber woman with long wavy hair, half hidden in shadow, mutters to herself in disgust against a background swirling with red chaos. A whip cracks through the air, echoing loudly as tension spikes in the room. A woman in blue dress kneels on the floor while a man with whip stands nearby, and she wonders why he is so possessive of her. A solemn young man with dark hair stares ahead, reflecting that someone in his life treats him like a disposable tool without remorse. Soft petals drift past a wooden bell as a distant voice remembers receiving a marriage proposal from a duke at 15. A young noble stands alone in a harsh spotlight as mocking nobles jeer, and he tries to defend himself, insisting the rumors about him aren't true. A gentle hand rests on the blonde-haired character's shoulder, and she reflects that her new family has only shown her kindness so far. A blonde woman looks down, thinking she refused the marriage proposal to keep her loved ones safe. A once warm and radiant but now cold and serious Pope stands as his warmth vanishes, leaving only a stern presence in the darkened room. A chilling wave of déjà vu swept over the narrator, making everything around them feel suddenly and intensely familiar. Smoke curled from the melting candle, and someone quietly admitted this place felt no different from before. A dark, cloudy night hung over the estate as Cesar beat the solemn young woman until she pleaded with him to stop. A woman in historical dress sits by the window, quietly thinking that Rebecca's lack of blood ties to the Pope only deepened the family's cruelty. A woman lies alone in the dim room, and someone recalls that Carmen, who died after childbirth, had already been pregnant before meeting the Pope. A solemn young woman recalled how she learned to act for survival, thinking it was harsh being treated this way just because they weren't related by blood. A blonde girl sniffs and wipes away her tears, silently reminding herself to keep acting disappointed as a gentle hand pats her head. A calm man with dark hair smiled gently as someone off-screen angrily accused him of being a monster, but he quietly admitted that leaving was painful for him too. The calm, dark-haired man listened as the accusing and furious woman called him the most terrible person in the world. A nervous figure in frilled black and white clothing fiddled with a teacup, voicing fears about the north being full of demonic monsters. A blonde-haired young woman received a gentle caress as a man promised she'd be protected by the bravest knights and that he'd try to visit her. A comforting and supportive figure gently stroked the blonde woman's hair, reassuring her that 6 months away might end up feeling like a much-needed vacation. A dark-haired man gently kissed a lock of blonde hair, quietly assuring the worried woman she only needed to wait 6 months and had nothing to fear. A pensive blonde woman twisted a strand of her hair, quietly insisting the other person didn't understand what truly worried her. The woman with long wavy hair quietly asked the man with dark hair to promise he'd come visit her often. A young man gently brushed his hand across the blonde woman's cheek as she softly assured him everything was fine. A distressed and pleading voice begged someone not to come. A solemn young woman smiled softly, admitting to herself that just surviving was already difficult enough. 3 figures stood tightly together under the spotlight, and the blonde woman worried that even if she refused to poison Iski's sister, Cesar would not stop. Still, the blonde woman realized that if Cesar succeeded, suspicion would immediately fall on her. A pair of gloved hands gently lifted a teacup, and the gloved figure began outlining their top priorities for the next 6 months. The blonde woman resolved to stop the assassination of Iski's sister, and decided she needed to prove she posed no threat. A blonde woman stood by the water, quietly admitting to herself that she was repeating the same actions as before. A graceful and poised woman in white stepped lightly onto the shimmering red floor, her calm presence radiating with each movement. A blonde woman in an elegant wedding dress stood silently, her expression solemn beneath the bright light of the ornate hall. A warm, joyful priest recognized the veiled woman and exclaimed that he could hardly believe it was truly her standing before him. A man with an affectionate gaze told the bridal and happy woman she looked so beautiful that everyone in the north would surely fall for her. A tearful blonde woman smiled gently at the man and called out to him as father. A comforting man gently patted the crying blonde girl on the head, telling her not to cry and that this wasn't goodbye forever, though she silently wished it was. A gentle-looking man gave a soft farewell, saying he would miss the unseen person very much. A gentle man wiped tears from the smiling blonde woman's face, and told her he was glad she understood her brother could not join her journey. A calm and composed blonde woman remarked that adding to the rumors about her and Cesar would only make things worse. A serious and observant man remarked that anyone could see how much disdain the northerners held for them. A young man with dark hair smiled softly, while someone nearby wondered aloud whether he was truly oblivious or just pretending. An angry young man with reddish-brown hair burst out that he couldn't believe they were repeating this, demanding to know why no one else seemed upset. Enzo turned his head, his gaze serious as someone nearby quietly murmured his name. Enzo, a brown-haired man, gently opened the hands of the nervous bride as she stood tense in her wedding dress. A blonde girl wrapped her arms around the brown-haired man, who stiffened slightly but did not pull away. Enzo hugged the blonde woman, and she quietly remembered that although he was reckless and troublesome, he never brought her any pain. A blonde woman hugged the brown-haired person and quietly told them they were the only normal one in the family, saying she would miss them. The blonde girl squeezed the brown-haired boy even tighter, insisting loudly that she wouldn't miss him and complaining he was suffocating her. A dark-haired man with a calm presence ordered Enzo to release the blonde woman, insisting he should notice that she was struggling to breathe. The dark-haired young man gently lifted the blonde woman's face and softly spoke her name, revealing her as Ruby for the first time. A young woman with blonde hair trembled as she whispered Cesar's name, her cheek cupped gently by an unseen figure's hand. A young man with dark hair quietly reminded the unseen listener that he expected them to keep their promise to visit him. A man gently held the blonde woman's chin, assuring her he would remember what mattered. Still, a young woman with blonde hair and a man stood close together, each silently preparing for what lay ahead. A solemn young woman with long blonde hair sat in her wedding dress, quietly reflecting that she had finally received the death she longed for. A contemplative young woman with long hair gazed through the window, quietly admitting she was doing everything possible to survive in a life unchanged. Sunlight streamed through swaying leaves, casting gentle patterns across the quiet forest. Then, a confident blonde man in armor stood tall while those around him bent over, struggling to catch their breath. A blonde man in a dark outfit wiped sweat from his face and remarked that everyone looked like they were on the verge of collapse. Footsteps approached as a knight in armor, still calm, removed his helmet and someone asked if they could speak with Iski for a moment. Still, a silver-haired man in ornate black armor stood silently, beads of sweat tracing his serious expression beneath the soft light. The blonde man stood firm, rejecting the silver-haired man's request with a curt refusal. The young man with light brown hair snapped in frustration, unable to believe what he was hearing. The blonde man demanded to know why he was being refused, and the dark-armored man calmly replied that Ellen had clearly sent him. The blonde man snapped that the armored figure should just do what his sister wanted so he wouldn't have to suffer through another one of his phases. The silver-haired man said it wasn't his fault that someone had a weakness for his sister. Suddenly, a serious-looking man was stabbed, and he told his attacker that this made him a meddling, presumptuous bastard. A young man with dark hair silently urged himself to stay calm and breathe, struggling to keep his frustration in check. A silver-haired man in armor stands by a tree, while someone off-screen informs him that his bride has already arrived at Omerta Castle. A helmet hit the ground with a heavy thud as an unseen speaker suggested the listener should at least join her for a proper meal. A white-haired man with red eyes smirked and asked if his bride had been welcomed by others before he arrived. A blonde paladin tried to explain his role defending the north, but someone impatiently cut him off and told him to stop making excuses. The white-haired man clenched his fist and shouted that he went because he was curious, daring anyone to challenge him. A blonde woman sat framed by a golden mirror and insisted she only wanted to meet the Pope's daughter, challenging anyone who questioned her motives. A frustrated voice shouted from the clearing, while an observant and calm man quietly thought that people with similar attitudes always seemed to end up together. A blonde-haired soldier huffed and hissed at a white-haired soldier, while a cartoon bird fluttered overhead in the awkward silence. The blonde-haired man rubbed his forehead and admitted to the white-haired man that he had been too harsh. One person wondered if the other had any more questions, while the second simply asked what those questions might be about. The blonde man pressed, asking if the white-haired man was curious about whether she looked like her portrait or what her personality was like. The white-haired young man replied that he wasn't really curious. The blonde knight suggested saving the surprise and told the silver-haired knight to prepare for his duties as a husband, mentioning a Lembrant noble. A desperate man in a military-style uniform sobbed and insisted he would not tolerate being ridiculed, quietly claiming he was not impotent. Birds soared through the bright sky as an unseen voice questioned how long anyone expected this marriage to last, doubting both partners' prospects. A blonde man with a cape muttered that the pale young man should have picked Freya, but said there was no point explaining further. A bride arriving for her wedding descended the ship's gangway, escorted by a man in a cloak, while soldiers and onlookers watched in silence. A young blonde woman in a wedding dress leaned weakly against the rail, seasick, as a man with light brown hair steadied her on the ship. A radiant blonde woman smiled as she took someone's hand, surrounded by sparkling lilies of the valley. Two officers in uniform watched a somber princess and her companion walk ahead, while one quietly urged her to stay strong. He said she was beautiful, but also admitted there was something unstable about her. One armored man with blonde hair quietly told the dark-haired man that she looked pretty small, then asked what he thought. The blonde man in armor pointed downward, explaining that she was small and asking if the other person remembered anything else. A pale young man with white hair glared in silence, his expression tense against the dark, rippling backdrop. A blonde woman in an elegant dress stands alone, gazing out the bright window as loneliness fills the dark room behind her. The blonde knight confidently declared that, as an honorable protector, he never discriminated and welcomed anyone who sought his help. The silver-haired man challenged the blonde man, insisting he once wanted to kill the Pope, while the blonde man anxiously protested and tried to change the subject. The silver-haired man taunted the blonde-haired man, claiming some people would betray their country for a beautiful face. The blonde-haired young man spun to face the silver-haired man, determination flaring between them as tension filled the air. Then a blonde man with a sword drew his shining blade and leveled it at another blonde man with purple eyes, setting their standoff ablaze. A gloved hand with an orange bracelet reached out, pausing just short of the light-haired person. A furious blonde man yanked the white-haired boy's ear, shouting that he would never betray his country, while the boy desperately apologized and begged for mercy. Lorenzo, a blonde young man, glanced nervously to the side as someone nearby wondered aloud if he was acting out because of a phase. A solemn white-haired man in armor stared forward, his presence heavy in the dark and ominous silence. A nervous light-haired character gulped, struggling to say something about Sir Iski. Someone hidden suggested they would be pleased if the listener divorced the Borgia woman and married their sister, but asked for feigned dislike until then. A white-haired armored man stood silent with his arms crossed while the bewildered armored man beside him asked what was going on. An angry and frustrated authority figure struck the overwhelmed person and demanded that they explain themselves, complaining about how kids behave these days. A young man with light hair nervously rubbed his head and asked Sir Iski to stay away from his sister for a while. A warning echoed that if nothing changed, the Borgia witch would torment his sister relentlessly. A blonde woman in a purple dress fell backward as a dark force struck her from behind. A confident blonde man scolded an upset blonde boy for being prejudiced, while the boy insisted he wasn't, and a white-haired figure looked away. A concerned sibling peeked into the dim room, wondering aloud why his sister had been crying alone since returning from Omerta Castle. Someone asked where Freya had gone, and another replied that she was at Omerta Castle. Tea poured into delicate cups as the reflective observer explained that, when Lady Rudbeckia arrived at the castle, his sister was having tea with Lady Alenia. A blonde man clenched his fist, thinking everyone around was insensitive and complaining about his sister crying after meeting Iski's wife face to face. A serious man with light hair and red eyes stepped forward as two surprised men called out, asking if he was Sir Iski. A silver-haired armored figure walked away toward the sunlit forest as someone called out, urgently asking where Iski was going. The blonde man yanked the messy-haired man back as he insisted they still had more to discuss, while Sir Iski strode away, declaring he was leaving. The blonde soldier insisted he only heard what he wanted and refused to listen, while three exhausted men lay sprawled on the shaded ground. The blonde knight let out a weary sigh, unaware that a smaller figure watched him quietly from behind the bush. The white-haired man walked alone down the sunlit forest path, his cape trailing quietly behind him.